Somewhere between the eastern Carolina tobacco fields and the Cape Fear River, a plantation existed that local records deliberately obscured for over a century. From 1839 to 1857, 11 men vanished from its quarters without any explanation. Nothing was recorded by the authorities. The churches remained silent. Then, in 1856, something was born in that house that compelled wealthy collectors from 3 states to travel in secret, carrying bags of gold coins they would never acknowledge in their ledgers. Falsified birth records, backdated legal contracts, and encrypted letters between prominent families documented the child's existence, all carefully hidden until a 1923 courthouse fire accidentally exposed what an entire county had conspired to bury. Before we continue with the story of Holoest Plantation and the Vance family legacy, I need you to do something for me. If you're fascinated by true historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and terrifying possibility, hit that subscribe button right now. And I want to know, drop a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Are you close to where this happened? Let's find out together. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not what was recorded, but what was systematically erased, and why an entire community chose silence over justice. In DePan County, North Carolina, 7 miles south of where the roads fork toward Wilmington and Raleigh, Holoest Plantation sat on 470 acres of increasingly exhausted soil. By 1839, the estate that had once produced prosperity for 3 generations had become a monument to decline. The tobacco that had made the Vance family wealthy in the 1790s no longer grew with the same vigor. Depleted by decades of intensive cultivation and a stubborn refusal to rotate crops, the soil yielded smaller returns with each harvest season. Constructed from local cypress and brick fired in kilns on the property, the house itself stood 3 stories tall. Its windows faced east toward the sunrise, a deliberate choice by the original builder who believed morning light would bless the family with continued prosperity. But by the time Nathaniel Vance inherited the estate in 1829 at age 37, those windows reflected only the reality of diminishing returns. Paint peeled from the columns. Several shutters hung at awkward angles, their hinges rusted by the humid coastal air. The formal gardens his grandmother had maintained with such pride had surrendered to weeds that grew waist-high by late summer. Nathaniel Vance was a man whose appearance suggested a prosperity his circumstances no longer supported. He stood just under 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and thick hands of someone who had once performed manual labor but had spent the last 2 decades avoiding it. His hair, still mostly dark at 47, was always pomaded and combed with precision. He wore tailored coats from a Wilmington clothier, even though he hadn't paid the man's invoices in 3 years. His boots were polished each morning by Samuel, one of the few enslaved men he hadn't yet sold to cover debts. The plantation maintained 32 enslaved people in 1839, down from 87 used 5 years earlier. Nathaniel had sold them in groups, families separated and scattered to plantations throughout the eastern counties, to textile mills in Raleigh, to shipbuilders in Wilmington who needed strong backs for heavy labor. Each sale provided temporary relief from creditors, but never enough to stop the slow collapse. The merchant bank in Wilmington held mortgages on both the land and the remaining people, with the interest compounding quarterly. Nathaniel had married twice. His first wife, Catherine, died in 1829 giving birth to their 3rd child, a son who survived only 4 days. His second wife, Margaret, whom he married in 1831, came from a wealthy Charleston family. She brought a substantial dowry that temporarily stabilized the plantation's finances, and she brought something else. After 2 years of marriage, she gave birth to a daughter in the winter of 1827. The child, Elizabeth, was born during an ice storm that knocked down trees across 3 counties and killed livestock that couldn't find shelter. The midwife who attended the birth, a free woman of color named Ruth Carver who had delivered babies throughout DePan County for 20 years, noticed something wrong within hours. The infant's eyes did not follow the candle flame. They did not track movement. When Ruth passed her hand close to the baby's face, there was no response, no instinctive focusing that healthy newborns displayed. Mr. Vance, Ruth had said carefully, standing in the doorway of the bedroom where Margaret lay exhausted, the child cannot see. Both eyes. It is not temporary. Nathaniel's response was to immediately pay Ruth triple her usual fee and make her sign a document stating the child was healthy and normal in every way. He told her that if she spoke to anyone about the girl's condition, he would ensure she never worked in the county again. And in 1827, a free woman of color threatening a white man's reputation could face far worse consequences than unemployment. Ruth took the money and signed the paper with an X, because she could not write her name, and she never spoke of it publicly again. Margaret Vance lasted 18 months after Elizabeth's birth before she took 40 drops of laudanum one April evening and never woke up. The official cause of death recorded by Dr. Ephraim Stokes was respiratory failure. No one questioned it. Women died frequently enough that another wealthy wife succumbing to an unnamed illness drew little attention. She was buried in the family plot behind the house beneath a marker that listed her name, her dates, and nothing else. Nathaniel raised Elizabeth in near isolation. The girl grew up confined primarily to the second floor of the house in rooms where the windows were kept shuttered. She learned to navigate by touch and sound, her small hands trailing along walls, her footsteps cautious on the wooden floors. A woman named Ada, one of the enslaved people who worked in the house, cared for Elizabeth during her early years. Ada taught the girl to count, to recognize voices, to understand the passage of time by the meals served and the temperature of the air coming through the shutters. By the time Elizabeth reached age 6, Nathaniel had decided she would not be educated beyond basic literacy. He hired no tutors. She learned to read through touch, her fingers exploring raised letters that Ada painstakingly carved into wooden blocks in secret, working by candlelight after finishing her daily tasks. The girl's world consisted of 14 rooms, one hallway, and a narrow set of stairs. She descended only when summoned. Year by year, the plantation's financial situation worsened. Nathaniel tried various schemes to restore prosperity. He planted cotton one season, but the soil rejected it. He invested in a turpentine operation that failed when the trees produced insufficient resin. He attempted to breed horses, but disease killed 7 of his 12 animals in a single summer. By 1838, he had sold nearly everything of value except the land itself and the people who worked it. He stopped attending church in 1837 after the minister, Reverend Thomas Gaines, suggested from the pulpit that prosperity reflected God's favor, and that financial ruin often indicated moral failings requiring examination and repentance. Nathaniel walked out in the middle of the sermon and never returned, though he continued paying his annual tithe, late and in diminishing amounts, to maintain appearances. The isolation of Hollow Crest increased as neighbors stopped visiting. Partly this was due to Nathaniel's deteriorating temperament and his tendency to dominate conversations with elaborate explanations for why his failures were never his fault: bad luck, poor weather, dishonest business partners, incompetent workers. But the isolation also stemmed from quiet rumors about the locked second floor, about a child some people had heard crying but never seen, about why Margaret had really taken so much laudanum that spring evening. By early 1839, when Elizabeth was approaching her teenage years, Nathaniel spent long hours in his study reviewing account books that contained nothing but debt. The merchant bank in Wilmington had begun foreclosure proceedings. They had perhaps 18 months before they would seize everything: the house, the land, the people, every remaining possession. His daughter, blind and unmarriageable by the standards of their society, represented nothing but continued expense. She would inherit nothing because there would be nothing to inherit. It was during one of these long evenings, reviewing documents and drinking whiskey that burned his throat, that Nathaniel discovered something in his late father's papers. A legal precedent, a case from 1791 involving a dispute over inheritance and property classifications. The case hinged on a technical interpretation of North Carolina law regarding children born to enslaved mothers versus children born to free women, and the specific circumstances under which a child might be legally reclassified based on parentage documentation. The details were complex, full of legal language that Nathaniel had to read 3 times before he understood the implications. But once he grasped it, an idea formed that was so monstrous, so calculated, that it would have seemed impossible if not for the desperate mathematics of debt that surrounded him. His daughter Elizabeth was free and white by birth. But if she were to bear a child, and if that child's paternity could be documented in a specific way, and if certain legal papers were filed in a particular sequence, then that child might be classified not as his grandchild, but as property of the estate. Valuable property, the kind that wealthy collectors throughout the South would pay extraordinary sums to acquire. In the society of antebellum North Carolina, a hidden market existed for enslaved people with specific characteristics. Light-skinned children, particularly those with documented European ancestry, commanded premium prices. They were purchased as house servants, as status symbols, as evidence of their owner's wealth and taste. The more unusual the circumstances of their birth, the higher the price. And the child born to a blonde white woman with carefully documented mixed parentage, such a child would be extraordinary enough to attract buyers willing to pay in gold rather than promissory notes. Nathaniel sat in his study until dawn, working through the legal mechanics. It would need to document everything correctly. It would need physicians who would sign the right papers. It would need witnesses who could be trusted to remember only what they were told to remember. He would need to select the men carefully, choosing for traits that would make the eventual child valuable. And he would need time, several years, to execute the plan before the bank foreclosed. The first light of morning came through the study windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and the scatter of legal documents across his desk. Nathaniel Vance made his decision. It would save his estate through the one asset everyone believed was worthless. His blind daughter on the second floor, who had no idea her father's desperation was about to transform her future in ways she could never have imagined. The moral calculus of slavery had already taught men like Nathaniel to see human beings as property, to value them as commodities, to calculate their worth in dollars and cents. What he planned was simply an extension of that logic applied to his own bloodline. It was monstrous, yes, but in a society built on monstrous foundations, it was also, by the twisted reasoning of the time, legal. Technically legal. Legal enough that with the right documentation and the right silence from the right people, it could work. Outside, morning broke over the exhausted fields of Hollow Crest Plantation. Enslaved people emerged from their quarters to begin another day of labor. Ada climbed the stairs to bring Elizabeth her breakfast, and Nathaniel Vance began writing letters to three men he knew would understand what he was proposing and why, because they too were drowning in debt, and they too had learned to see opportunity where decent people saw only horror. The conspiracy was about to begin. The first letter Nathaniel Vance wrote went to Dr. Ephraim Stokes, the physician who had attended Margaret's death and signed the certificate declaring respiratory failure. Stokes maintained a practice in Cannonsville, the county seat, where he served as both doctor and coroner. He was 56 years old, recently widowed, and heavily in debt after his late wife's extended illness had consumed his savings. More importantly, he was the only physician within 30 miles who had the authority to sign birth certificates, medical examinations, and legal certifications without significant scrutiny. The letter was carefully worded. Nathaniel wrote of needing medical consultation regarding his daughter's future welfare, of certain legal arrangements that might require professional documentation, of compensation that would be generous and guaranteed regardless of the estate's other financial difficulties. It did not specify details. Men like Stokes understood that certain conversations happened only in person, in private, where no written record could later surface. The second letter went to Magistrate Calvin Pritchard, who presided over legal matters in DePan County from an office above a tobacco warehouse in Cannonsville. Pritchard was 48, ambitious, and frustrated by his limited opportunities in a county where the established wealthy families controlled most positions of real power. He had accumulated gambling debts in Wilmington, debts owed to men who did not accept delayed payment or negotiated settlements. Nathaniel knew about these debts because Pritchard had approached him 2 years earlier seeking a loan, which Nathaniel had refused. Now that refusal became leverage. The letter to Pritchard mentioned a legal matter requiring expert consultation regarding property law and inheritance statutes, hinting at significant compensation for services rendered. Again, no specifics, just enough to ensure Pritchard would come to Hollowest prepared to listen. The third letter went to Thomas Harrington, who operated a brokerage in Wilmington specializing in the sale of enslaved people. Harrington had connections throughout the South, to plantation owners in Louisiana who wanted light-skinned house servants, to wealthy merchants in Charleston who collected exotic acquisitions, to private buyers who paid premium prices for people who met specific criteria. Harrington worked on commission, taking 20% of each sale, and he had never been particular about the circumstances that brought people into his inventory. Nathaniel had sold enslaved people through Harrington before. The man was discreet, efficient, and motivated entirely by profit. This letter was more direct. Nathaniel wrote that he expected to have available within approximately 2 years a unique acquisition that would attract serious collectors. It provided no details about what made this acquisition unique, only that interested buyers should be cultivated in advance and that the eventual sale would be extremely profitable for all parties involved. All 3 men responded within 2 weeks. Dr. Stokes arrived first, riding up to Hallowest on a humid afternoon in late March 1839. Nathaniel received him in the study, doors closed, windows shuttered despite the warmth. The conversation lasted 3 hours. When Stokes emerged, his face was pale, but he carried a leather portfolio containing papers Nathaniel had prepared, legal precedents, property law interpretations, medical documentation protocols. Stokes left with a promissory note for $500 payable upon completion of certain specified services. He signed the agreement without hesitation. Magistrate Pritchard came next, arriving after dark to avoid being seen by too many people. His meeting with Nathaniel lasted longer, nearly 5 hours, because the legal mechanisms were more complex: property classification statutes, documentation requirements, registration procedures, timing requirements for filing various certificates with county and state authorities. Pritchard took extensive notes. When he finally left well after midnight, he carried copies of the relevant statutes and a promissory note for $800. He also carried Nathaniel's explicit promise that those gambling debts in Wilmington would be settled in full from the proceeds of the eventual sale. Thomas Harrington required no in-person meeting. His response letter, written in the careful code language of his profession, indicated he understood exactly what was being proposed. He had 3 potential buyers already in mind: a plantation owner near Baton Rouge who collected unusual acquisitions, a Charleston merchant who operated a private salon featuring exotic servants, and a wealthy Virginia family seeking a particular kind of status symbol. All 3 would pay between $3,000 and $5,000 for the right acquisition. Harrington's commission would be 20%, as always. He suggested Nathaniel begin the process as soon as possible, as market conditions were favorable and discretion was guaranteed. With his conspirators secured, Nathaniel turned to the most delicate part of his plan: preparing Elizabeth. The girl was now approaching her teenage years, navigating her second-floor prison with the confidence of long practice. Ada still cared for her, bringing meals, reading to her in the evenings, helping her bathe and dress. Elizabeth trusted Ada completely. That trust would be essential. Nathaniel began by changing Elizabeth's routine. Instead of taking meals in her room, she was now required to come downstairs to the formal dining room once each week. She was terrified at first. The stairs were a challenge she had rarely attempted. But Ada helped her, guiding her step by step, until she learned the count: 16 steps down, turn left, 12 paces to the dining room door. During these meals, Nathaniel spoke to Elizabeth about duty and family obligation. He told her the plantation was in danger, that they might lose everything, that she needed to understand her role in preserving their legacy. He never mentioned specifics. Not yet. He simply accustomed her to being downstairs, to following instructions, to accepting that her father's plans were not subject to her understanding or approval. In May of 1839, Nathaniel began selecting the men. He reviewed the enslaved population of Hallowest with the cold calculation of someone breeding livestock for market. He wanted specific physical characteristics: height above average, symmetrical features, lighter skin tones if possible, no obvious physical defects or scars. He also wanted men who were young, healthy, and unlikely to resist or attempt escape afterward. The first man he selected was named Jacob. He was 24 years old, tall, and strongly built from years of field labor. His mother had been part of the household when Nathaniel's father ran the plantation. His father had been a white overseer who left North Carolina before Jacob was born. Jacob's skin was several shades lighter than most of the other enslaved people at Holocaust, and his features suggested mixed ancestry. He could read and write, forbidden skills that Ada had secretly taught him years earlier, and he worked as the head of one of the field crews. Nathaniel moved Jacob from the field quarters to a small room in the main house's ground floor, ostensibly to train him as a house servant. Jacob was suspicious immediately. Such promotions were rare and usually preceded sale to another estate, but he had no choice except to obey. Refusing would mean immediate punishment and likely sale anyway. The second man selected was Daniel, 19 years old, shorter than Jacob, but quick and intelligent. He worked in the stables, managing the few remaining horses and the 2 mules that pulled the tobacco wagon. Daniel's mother had come from Virginia, sold south when her previous owner died. His father, according to plantation records, was unknown, but his light eyes and straight hair suggested European ancestry somewhere in his bloodline. The third was Isaac, 22, who worked primarily in the carpentry shop, repairing tools and buildings. He had a gift for working with his hands, creating tight joints and smooth surfaces that held for years. It was quiet, observant, and careful, qualities that made overseers trust him with important tasks, but also qualities that made him dangerous, because quiet observation meant he understood far more than he revealed. Nathaniel selected 8 others over the following weeks, rotating them into various positions around the main house. Some worked in the kitchen, others maintained the gardens. One, a man named Samuel, who had been with the family for 30 years, served as Nathaniel's personal valet. All 11 were isolated from the remaining enslaved population, housed separately, given better food, and lighter work. The other enslaved people at Holocaust noticed these changes and whispered about them in the evenings after labor ended. Something was happening in the main house. Master Vance was planning something. The men being selected were all young, all strong, all being treated with unusual care, but no one knew exactly what was coming, only that it would not be good, because nothing involving unusual attention from Nathaniel Vance ever ended well. Over the following years, Nathaniel refined his legal documentation. Magistrate Pritchard visited Holocaust several more times, each visit occurring after dark to avoid observation. They reviewed the property classification statutes repeatedly, ensuring every detail was correct. They prepared multiple versions of Elizabeth's birth certificate, one accurate, one falsified to suggest she was born to an enslaved mother. The false certificate would be filed years hence, backdated to 1827, replacing the accurate document in county records. Pritchard had the authority to make such substitutions, and no one would question his certification. Dr. Stokes continued his periodic examinations of Elizabeth, documenting her physical development with clinical detachment. Nathaniel informed him that the plan would begin when Elizabeth reached full maturity, which by the standards and understanding of their time meant her late teenage years, when she would be physically capable of bearing children safely. Elizabeth knew none of this. She continued her limited existence on the second floor, unaware of the conspiracy developing around her. Ada tried several times to find ways to warn her, but what could she say? The truth was too horrible, and speaking it aloud would result in Ada's immediate sale and punishment. So Ada remained silent, helping Elizabeth learn and grow while knowing that a terrible future awaited the girl. It was an elaborate fiction that rested on a horrible truth. In the legal system of antebellum North Carolina, enslaved status followed the mother's condition. If Nathaniel could create documentation suggesting Elizabeth was enslaved, documentation that no one would challenge because he controlled the witnesses and authorities, then her child would automatically be enslaved as well, regardless of the child's actual ancestry. The fact that Elizabeth was actually his legitimate daughter would be obscured by carefully constructed lies, by backdated papers, by the silence of everyone involved. Magistrate Pritchard began preparing the legal documents, property registrations, ownership transfers, birth certificate templates ready to be filled in years hence. Every document was precisely dated, precisely worded, designed to create an unbreakable legal chain. Pritchard worked alone in his office above the tobacco warehouse, windows shuttered, lamp burning long after midnight. No clerks assisted him. No other lawyers reviewed his work. The conspiracy succeeded because it involved so few people and because those people were motivated by either debt or greed to maintain absolute silence. Thomas Harrington, meanwhile, cultivated his buyers. He sent carefully worded letters describing an upcoming acquisition that would be unique in the market, a child of mixed ancestry with extraordinary circumstances of birth, educated and refined beyond typical classifications. He did not mention Nathaniel Vance or Hollowest Plantation. He only said the acquisition would be available in approximately 3 years and that serious buyers should prepare funds accordingly. 2 of his 3 contacted buyers responded with strong interest and requests to be notified the moment the acquisition became available. Back at Hollowest, the 11 selected men continued their new routines, still unaware of exactly what Nathaniel planned for them. They knew something was wrong, the isolation, the special treatment, the way Ada sometimes looked at them with what seemed like pity. But in the system that controlled their lives, questioning the master's intentions was pointless. They worked, they obeyed, and they waited to discover what fresh horror awaited them. Ada knew more than the men. She understood from fragments of conversation overheard and from the way Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth during those weekly dinners that something terrible was being prepared. She tried once to ask Nathaniel directly what he planned. He told her that if she interfered or spoke to anyone at all, about what happened in the house, he would sell her immediately to a turpentine camp where enslaved women typically survived less than 2 years. Ada was in her 40s. She had lived at Hollowest since she was young. The threat was sufficient to ensure her silence, though not her cooperation. She could not stop what was coming, but she privately vowed to help Elizabeth survive it, whatever it was. By late 1843, the architecture of Nathaniel's conspiracy was complete. The doctor was secured. The magistrate was prepared. The broker had buyers ready. The legal documentation existed in draft form, waiting only for specific dates and details to be filled in. The men were selected and isolated, and Elizabeth, now 16 years old, continued her routines on the second floor, unaware that her father had already mapped out her future and her child's future to pay his debts. Elizabeth turned 18 pulgadas the winter of 1845. By the standards of antebellum North Carolina society, she was now of age, old enough to marry, old enough to bear children, old enough to be subject to her father's absolute authority over her future. The merchant bank in Wilmington had given Nathaniel until January 1846 to pay his accumulated debt or face foreclosure. The timeline was tight, but Nathaniel judged it sufficient. In the spring of 1845, Dr. Stokes examined Elizabeth and certified her physically capable of pregnancy. The examination was clinical and impersonal. Elizabeth, isolated her entire life, had no framework to understand what was being assessed or why. Stokes documented everything and signed the medical certificate that Nathaniel required for his legal documentation. What happened over the following months at Hollowest was a systematic violation of human dignity that the legal framework of slavery made possible. Nathaniel executed his plan with cold precision. The 11 men, one after another, were brought into situations they could not refuse under threat of violence, sale, or death. Elizabeth, blind and isolated, had no power to resist her father's control. Ada, who witnessed everything, was powerless to intervene without facing her own destruction. The details of these months need not be explicit to convey their horror. What matters is understanding that this was not violence born of passion or rage. It was calculated exploitation, documented and planned, executed with the systematic efficiency of a business transaction. The men involved were victims as much as Elizabeth, forced into actions they would never have chosen, threatened with consequences they could not escape. By July of 1845, Dr. Stokes confirmed Elizabeth was pregnant. The plan moved to its next phase, maintaining the pregnancy, preparing for birth, and ensuring all legal documentation would be ready for the moment the child arrived. Elizabeth spent her pregnancy in the same second-floor rooms where she had spent her entire life. Ada cared for her, bringing meals the girl barely touched. Elizabeth's body changed in ways that terrified her, movements inside her that she didn't understand, physical discomfort she had no context to interpret. Ada tried to explain, tried to prepare her. But how do you prepare someone for giving birth to a child conceived in such circumstances? Nathaniel treated the pregnancy as a business matter. Dr. Stokes visited regularly to ensure everything progressed normally. Nathaniel corresponded with Thomas Harrington about potential buyers. Magistrate Pritchard finalized the legal documents that would classify the child as enslaved property from birth. The falsified documentation was elegant in its deception. Pritchard had created a complete backstory. Elizabeth was actually the daughter of an enslaved woman named Sarah who had worked at Holocaust years ago. Nathaniel had adopted this child out of charity and raised her in the house because of her blindness. Documents backdated to 1827 supported this fiction. The real birth certificate for Elizabeth was removed from county records and replaced with the falsified version. Now, legally, Elizabeth herself was enslaved, which meant her child would be born into slavery automatically, regardless of paternity. In November of 1845, something occurred that threatened to expose the conspiracy. Reverend Thomas Gaines, the minister Nathaniel had stopped attending years earlier, decided to visit Holocaust to check on his wayward parishioner. Nathaniel had not been to church in 8 years. The reverend arrived unannounced on a cold afternoon. They discussed theology and community matters in the parlor. Then Gaines mentioned he had heard rumors that Nathaniel's daughter was unwell and asked if he might visit her to offer prayer and comfort. Nathaniel's mind raced. Elizabeth was now visibly pregnant. If Gaines saw her, questions would arise that could not be satisfactorily answered. "My daughter is resting," Nathaniel said carefully. "She has been ill, and the doctor has ordered complete quiet. Perhaps another time." Reverend Gaines, sensing something amiss, pressed gently. But Nathaniel remained firm. The Reverend left troubled, but took no immediate action. In a society where men controlled their households absolutely and interference in family matters was considered inappropriate, Gaines's discomfort was insufficient to trigger investigation. Winter arrived. Elizabeth's pregnancy entered its final weeks. Dr. Stokes prepared for the delivery with the same clinical detachment he had shown throughout. On March 4, 1846, after a difficult labor that lasted nearly 20 hours, Elizabeth gave birth to a son. The child was healthy with features that clearly showed mixed ancestry, European and African in roughly equal measure. The infant was exactly what Nathaniel had calculated. Valuable. Elizabeth, exhausted beyond measure, asked in a broken voice if she could hold her baby. Nathaniel refused. The child was taken immediately for documentation. Ada, standing nearby, felt something inside her break permanently, watching a mother deny her newborn child. Dr. Stokes carried the infant downstairs to the study where Magistrate Pritchard was waiting with documents already prepared. The birth certificate was filled out, child born to Sarah, enslaved woman, deceased. Father unknown. Born March 4, 1846. Property of Nathaniel Vance. Pritchard signed and affixed his official seal. Stokes added his signature as attending physician. The fiction was now legal fact. The child was given the name Thomas, no surname, as enslaved people typically had none. It was placed with a wet nurse, an enslaved woman named Rebecca, who had recently given birth herself. Elizabeth, recovering upstairs, could sometimes hear the infant crying, but was never permitted near him. Nathaniel immediately contacted Thomas Harrington. The bidding began at $3,000 and quickly rose. By the end of March, the price had reached $4,700, more than enough to satisfy the merchant bank and save Holocaust from foreclosure. The buyer who paid the highest price was Charles Rutledge, a plantation owner from outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was 46 years old, wealthy from sugar production, and known among certain circles for collecting unusual human acquisitions for his household. His plantation employed over 200 enslaved people, and among them were several dozen who served as display pieces rather than field laborers. Rutledge had a particular interest in children who could be raised from infancy to be completely dependent on him. The logic of slavery had so thoroughly corrupted his moral reasoning that he genuinely thought purchasing an infant to be raised as exotic property was an act of generosity. He arrived at Holocaust on April 17, 1846, traveling by private coach with 2 servants. Nathaniel received him in the parlor. They discussed business, crop yields, market conditions, mutual acquaintances. Only after these pleasantries did Rutledge mention the real purpose of his visit. I understand you have an unusual acquisition available, he said carefully. I do, Nathaniel confirmed. Born 6 weeks ago, healthy, strong, good temperament. The circumstances of his birth make him particularly valuable. Nathaniel led Rutledge to see the child. Thomas lay in his crib wrapped in clean blankets. Rutledge examined him with the detachment of someone evaluating livestock. He noted the skin tone, the features, the general health. He asked about feeding patterns, sleep habits, any signs of illness. The birth certificate indicates the mother is deceased, Rutledge said. What were the circumstances? Nathaniel explained that the child's mother, Sarah, had been an enslaved woman who died during childbirth, a common enough occurrence that raised no suspicion. He showed Rutledge the birth certificate signed by both Dr. Stokes and Magistrate Pritchard. He emphasized that the child was legally classified as enslaved property from birth with clear documentation. What Nathaniel did not mention was that Elizabeth was recovering upstairs, that the dead Sarah was actually his living daughter, that the entire documentation was fraud. Rutledge asked no questions that would have exposed these lies because wealthy buyers purchasing unusual acquisitions understood that discretion was essential. $4,700, Rutledge said. Payable in gold today if the child can travel immediately. Agreed, Nathaniel said without hesitation. The transaction was completed within 2 hours. Rutledge's servants counted out gold coins, mostly eagles and double eagles, heavy and bright. Nathaniel signed the bill of sale. Magistrate Pritchard, present to witness, affixed his seal to the document. Rebecca, the wet nurse, prepared Thomas for travel. She wrapped him in warm blankets and gathered his few possessions. She had grown attached to the infant over the 6 weeks she had cared for him. But she had no power to resist the sale. She kissed the baby's forehead once before handing him to Rutledge's servants. Elizabeth, lying in her room upstairs, heard the commotion of departure, horses, carriage wheels, voices. Ada came to her and said quietly, "They are taking the baby away." "Where?" Elizabeth asked. "Away. You will never see him again." Elizabeth had not been permitted to hold her son even once. She did not know his name. She had heard him crying, but had never touched him, never fed him, never been allowed near him. The child was gone, and with him went any illusion that what had happened to her had been anything other than a calculated business transaction. Nathaniel watched Rutledge's carriage disappear down the road. He returned to his study, opened the safe, and counted the gold. 4,700 pesos, enough to satisfy the bank's demand with funds remaining for operations. The next morning, Nathaniel traveled to Wilmington and paid off the mortgage in full. The bank's president congratulated him on finding resources to save his estate. The foreclosure was cancelled. Haloist was safe. But the conspiracy had left too many witnesses, too many people who knew fragments of truth. Nathaniel understood that his secret was only as safe as the silence of everyone involved. And silence, he knew, was difficult to maintain indefinitely. The first crack in the conspiracy appeared 8 months after the sale, in December of 1846. Isaac, one of the 11 men, attempted to end his own life. It was discovered and stopped before he succeeded, but the attempt itself signaled that the psychological toll of what had occurred was becoming unsustainable. Isaac had been unable to reconcile what he had been forced to do with his continued existence. Nathaniel had him punished for the attempt and then sold him to a plantation in Virginia. The sale served 2 purposes, punishment and elimination of a witness. Isaac disappeared from DePen County, taking his knowledge with him, but also spreading it in whispered fragments to people he encountered in his new location. Ada remained at Haloist, still caring for Elizabeth, but her demeanor changed. She became withdrawn, speaking less, moving through her duties mechanically. Other enslaved people noticed and asked what was wrong, but Ada would not explain. The weight of what she had witnessed, combined with her inability to prevent or expose it, was crushing her spirit day by day. In March of 1847, exactly 1 year after Thomas's birth, Elizabeth's psychological state deteriorated sharply. She had been largely withdrawn since the delivery, barely eating, speaking only in monosyllables, spending her days lying in bed, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Now she began having episodes, screaming without provocation, refusing food for days, retreating so far into herself that Ada feared she might never return. Dr. Stokes was summoned. He examined her and declared she was suffering from nervous hysteria, a common diagnosis for women experiencing severe distress. His treatment consisted of laudanum and confinement. Elizabeth was kept sedated for weeks at a time, existing in a fog that provided no actual healing, only temporary suppression of symptoms. Nathaniel found her condition inconvenient. She required constant supervision. Ada could no longer manage her alone, so Nathaniel had to assign another enslaved woman to help. The additional attention meant more people aware that something was deeply wrong in the household, more potential witnesses to fragments of truth. In June of 1847, Reverend Gaines made another attempt to visit Elizabeth. He had been troubled by his previous encounter and had heard rumors in town that the daughter was gravely ill. This time he arrived unannounced, hoping to catch Nathaniel unprepared. He succeeded. Nathaniel was away in Kenansville on business when Gaines arrived. Ada answered the door. The Reverend explained he had come to offer spiritual comfort to Elizabeth. Ada, exhausted and desperate, made a decision that would have consequences. She let him in. Gaines climbed the stairs to Elizabeth's room. He found her lying in bed, thin and pale, eyes open but unseeing, clearly suffering from something far beyond ordinary illness. He sat beside her and asked gentle questions. At first, she did not respond, then slowly she began to speak. She told him fragments of what had happened. She did not have clear vocabulary to describe everything, but she spoke of confinement, of her father's plans, of men brought to her room, of pregnancy, and a child taken away. The story came out disjointed and incomplete, confused by medication and trauma. But Gaines understood enough to be horrified. When Nathaniel returned that evening and discovered Gaines had been in the house, he felt cold fear for the first time in years. He found Gaines sitting in the parlor waiting. Nathaniel, the Reverend said quietly. What have you done? My daughter is deeply troubled, Nathaniel replied carefully. She suffers from nervous hysteria. Her mind creates fictions. Dr. Stokes has documented her condition. Whatever she told you is the product of illness, nothing more. I do not believe you. Then believe Dr. Stokes. Believe Magistrate Preacher. Believe anyone in this county who will tell you that my daughter has been unwell for years and that her words cannot be trusted. Gaines left that evening, but he was not satisfied. He began asking questions in Kenansville, discreet questions about the Vance family, about Elizabeth, about any unusual events at Hollowest. He learned about the merchant banks near foreclosure and the sudden payment that saved the estate. He learned that Nathaniel had been seen with significant amounts of gold in early 1846. He heard whispers about enslaved men being kept isolated in the main house for extended periods. Gaines went to Magistrate Pritchard and expressed his concerns. He did not accuse anyone directly, he knew that would be dangerous. But he asked if there had been any unusual registrations or property transfers involving the Vance estate recently. Pritchard, who had hundreds of dollars of Nathaniel's gold hidden in his home, assured the Reverend that everything involving the Vance family was entirely proper and legally documented. He suggested that Gaines was meddling in matters that did not concern him, and that continued inquiry might be viewed as harassment of a respectable family. The warning was clear. Gaines understood that pursuing the matter further would make him enemies among the county's power structure. He was a minister with no legal authority, no investigative power, and no allies willing to challenge men like Nathaniel Vance and Calvin Pritchard. He recorded his suspicions in a private journal, but he took no further action. The conspiracy held because everyone with power had motivation to protect it. Dr. Stokes had been paid and had signed documents that would destroy his medical license if exposed as fraudulent. Magistrate Pritchard had facilitated fraud and falsified official records. Thomas Harrington had brokered the sale and collected his commission. Charles Rutledge owned a child whose purchase would be investigated if questions arose about the legitimacy of the transaction. And Nathaniel needed the entire structure to remain hidden to preserve his estate and avoid prosecution. The enslaved people who knew fragments of truth had no voice. They could not testify against white men in court. Their word would never be believed over the documented statements of physicians and magistrates. They could whisper among themselves, but those whispers stayed within their own community, never reaching ears that might act on the information. Years passed. Elizabeth remained confined to her room, medicated and broken. Ada grew old, caring for her, carrying the burden of witnessing horror she could not expose. The 11 men were gradually sold away, scattered to other plantations where their knowledge became disconnected from context. By 1850, Holoist had stabilized financially. The tobacco fields produced modest yields. Nathaniel maintained a small enslaved population and kept expenses low. A never remarried. A attended church occasionally, maintaining social connections necessary for business. A appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a widower managing a struggling estate, caring for an invalid daughter, doing his best under difficult circumstances. The truth remained buried in falsified documents, in sealed records, in the silence of conspirators, and the powerlessness of victims. Thomas grew up in Louisiana, never knowing his real mother, never knowing the circumstances of his birth, forever classified as property despite being the grandson of a wealthy plantation owner. Used when we thought we'd seen the depths of this horror, the true scale of the conspiracy would only become clear decades later when an accident would expose what an entire county had worked so hard to hide. If this story is giving you chills and you want to know how the secret was finally revealed, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the conclusion. Hit that like button to support content that uncovers the darkest corners of American history, and share this with someone who needs to understand that the real monsters often wear respectable faces. Let's discover together what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried. The truth might have stayed buried forever if not for a fire that destroyed the DePan County Courthouse in Cannonsville on October 14, 1923, 77 years after Thomas's birth. The fire started in a storage room where old records were kept in wooden filing cabinets. It spread rapidly, consuming most of the building before firefighters could contain it. Much of the county's historical documentation was destroyed. During the cleanup and recovery effort, workers sorting through water-damaged and partially burned documents discovered something strange: 2 birth certificates for the same person, both dated 1827, both claiming to document the birth of Elizabeth Vance. One certificate listed her parents as Nathaniel and Margaret Vance. The other listed her mother as Sarah, enslaved woman, deceased, and her father as unknown. The discovery made no sense. Why would 2 contradictory certificates exist for the same person? A local historian, Harold Jensen, became interested in the mystery. He began researching the Vance family, pulling together property records, bills of sale, tax documents, any surviving information about Hollow Crest Plantation. Jensen discovered the bill of sale from 1846 documenting the transfer of an infant named Thomas from Nathaniel Vance to Charles Rutledge of Louisiana. Jensen published his findings in the DePan County Historical Quarterly in 1924 under the title The Vance Family Mystery, Evidence of Documentary Fraud in Antebellum Property Records. His article carefully avoided making explicit accusations. It could not prove what had actually happened, only that the documents contained contradictions suggesting deliberate falsification. The article attracted attention from other historians and researchers. Some dismissed Jensen's work as overinterpretation of damaged documents. Others argued he had uncovered evidence of one of the most disturbing cases of legal exploitation in North Carolina's history: a father selling his own grandson by deliberately classifying the child as enslaved property through fraudulent documentation. Additional evidence surfaced over the following years. A diary kept by Reverend Thomas Gaines was discovered in a church archive in 1931. It contained entries describing his visits to Holoist, his conversation with Elizabeth, his suspicions about what had occurred, and his frustration at being unable to pursue the matter due to the county's power structure protecting Nathaniel Vance. In 1947, a descendant of Ada located a collection of letters Ada had written late in her life to a friend. These letters, never mailed, were found among Ada's possessions after her death. In them, she described in painful detail what she had witnessed at Holoist: the conspiracy, the systematic exploitation, the birth of Thomas, the sale to Charles Rutledge. She wrote, "I witnessed evil that I was powerless to stop, and that powerlessness has haunted me every day since." That child was born innocent into a system that made him property, and his own grandfather sold him for gold. These discoveries built a circumstantial case that historians now largely accept as accurate. Nathaniel Vance, facing financial ruin, orchestrated a conspiracy involving a physician, a magistrate, and a broker to exploit his blind daughter for profit. He used falsified legal documents to classify her child as enslaved property and sold that child to a Louisiana buyer for $4,700, using the proceeds to save his plantation from foreclosure. The conspiracy succeeded because it exploited the legal framework of slavery, which already classified human beings as property and gave masters nearly absolute power over them. It succeeded because the people with authority, doctors, magistrates, brokers, were motivated by debt and greed to participate. And it succeeded because the victims had no voice in a society that systematically denied them legal standing, credibility, and power. Elizabeth Vance died on November 3, 1863, at age 36, having spent the last 17 years of her life confined to her room at Holocaust, heavily medicated and psychologically destroyed. She was buried in the family plot without ceremony. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory illness, but Ada's letters suggest Elizabeth simply stopped eating and drinking, choosing release over continued suffering. Nathaniel Vance survived until 1871, dying at age 79. He never faced legal consequences for what he had done. He maintained his position in the community until the Civil War disrupted plantation society. After the war, he lived quietly at Holocaust, the estate diminished but still functioning. He was found dead in his study one morning in February, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him, an account book spread across his desk, still calculating profits and losses until his final moments. Dr. Ephraim Stokes died in 1854 of a stroke. Magistrate Calvin Pritchard was killed during the Civil War in 1864 when a Union cavalry unit raided Cannonsville. Thomas Harrington continued his business until the Emancipation Proclamation, after which he declared bankruptcy and died in poverty in 1867. Ada lived until 1882, surviving long enough to see the end of slavery, but never recovering from the trauma of what she had witnessed at Holocaust. Her letters suggest she viewed her long life as punishment rather than blessing, forced to live with memories she could never escape and knowledge she had been powerless to act upon. Of the 11 men involved in the conspiracy as victims, records suggest 9 were sold to other plantations between 1846 and 1852. One remained at Holocaust until the Civil War when he fled north and was never seen again. Isaac, who attempted to end his life and was sold to Virginia, died there in 1851 under circumstances recorded only as accident. Whether it was truly an accident or another attempt that succeeded, no one knows. Charles Rutledge, the Louisiana buyer, continued operating his plantation until 1863 when Union forces seized it during the war. The fate of Thomas, the child he purchased in 1846, is unknown. No records exist describing what happened to him after childhood. He may have escaped during the chaos of the Civil War. He may have died young, as many enslaved children did. He may have lived a long life, eventually gaining freedom, never knowing the truth about his birth or the circumstances that made him property instead of heir. Hollow Crest Plantation still exists, though in ruins. The main house collapsed in the 1950s, leaving only the brick foundation and parts of the first-floor walls. The land is privately owned, used for timber farming. Local preservation groups have occasionally discussed documenting the site's history, but the darkness of what occurred there makes it difficult to commemorate. The story of what happened at Holocaust between 1839 and 1846 represents one of the most disturbing documented cases of how the legal framework of slavery could be manipulated to commit atrocities that were technically legal within their historical context. It demonstrates how systems of oppression, once established, can be exploited in ways that follow logically from the fundamental premise that human beings can be property. It also reveals the profound powerlessness of victims within such systems. Elizabeth, blind and isolated, with no legal standing to resist her father, the 11 enslaved men forced into actions they would never have chosen, under threat of death or sale. Ada, witnessing everything but unable to speak or act without facing destruction herself, and Thomas, Born into slavery because his grandfather's desperation and the law's definitions intersected to deny him the freedom his ancestry should have guaranteed. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in DePen County's soul? The documents discovered in 1923 opened a window into this horror. But how many similar cases remain completely hidden, their victims and perpetrators all dead, their stories erased by time and deliberate destruction of evidence? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think. If you found this historical investigation compelling and disturbing, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into America's darkest secrets, and share this video with someone who needs to understand that horror is not always supernatural. Sometimes the real monsters are human, and the real terror comes from systems that allow them to operate with impunity. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another piece of history that